If you're watching this video right now, I need you to stop what you're doing for the next several minutes and listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. In more than 20 years working as a cardiologist, watching patient after patient walk into my office with the same story, I have come to understand something that most people refuse to accept until it is almost too late. High blood pressure, what we call in medicine hypertension, has been quietly changing. It is no longer the disease of your grandfather sitting in his recliner. It is no longer something you only worry about after you turn 60. In the last 10 years, I have seen patients as young as 28, 30, 35 walking into my office with pressure readings that would have shocked me 2 decades ago. And the most terrifying part, the part that keeps me thinking long after the office closes, is that almost every single one of them had been carrying warning signs for months, sometimes years, before they finally sat across from me. They had been feeling the alarms going off inside their own body, and they had learned to silence those alarms by calling them stress, by calling them a bad night of sleep, by calling them the price of a busy life. I want to talk to you today the way I would talk to my own son or daughter if they walked into my office. I want to strip away the medical jargon and the fear tactics and the empty warnings you have heard 1,000 times, and I want to show you 3 specific symptoms that in my clinical experience are the most commonly ignored, the most commonly dismissed, and the most commonly confused with the ordinary complaints of modern life. Because here is the truth that the health industry rarely tells you plainly. Hypertension does not usually announce itself with a heart attack, it announces itself with whispers, and by the time you finally listen, the damage in your arteries, in your kidneys, and the tiny vessels of your brain has already been quietly accumulating for years without your knowledge and without your consent. Let me start by explaining why this problem is arriving so much earlier in life than it used to. When I was in medical school, we were taught that essential hypertension was primarily a disease of aging. The body wears down, the arteries stiffen with the passage of time, and by the 6th or 7th decade of life, the pressure begins to climb. That was the model, that was the expectation, and for most of the 20th century, that model held reasonably true. But the world you live in today is not the world your grandparents lived in, and your body, which evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to handle a very different kind of stress, is now being asked to adapt to something completely unnatural. Think for a moment about what the average adult experiences in a single day. You wake up, often after 5 or 6 hours of interrupted sleep, and immediately reach for your phone. Before your feet even touch the floor, your brain has already been flooded with notifications, headlines, work emails, and images designed by the most sophisticated psychological engineering ever created to hijack your attention. Your cortisol, the stress hormone, spikes before you have even eaten breakfast. Then you rush through your morning, often skipping a proper meal or replacing it with something loaded with refined carbohydrates and caffeine. You sit down for 8, 9, sometimes 11 hours a day in front of a screen. Your body, which was designed to walk 12 or 15,000 steps a day gathering food and moving through varied terrain, spends the majority of its waking hours frozen in a chair. Your eyes stare at a light source about 50 centimeters from your face. Your shoulders creep up toward your ears. Your breath becomes shallow and rapid without you even noticing, and when the workday finally ends, instead of decompressing with human contact or physical movement, you scroll through another screen for 2 or 3 hours before falling into a restless sleep that does not truly restore you. Now multiply that by 5 days a week, by 50 weeks a year, by 10 or 15 years, and ask yourself what you think is happening inside your arteries during all that time, because I will tell you what is happening. Your sympathetic nervous system, the part of your body responsible for the fight or flight response, has been running in a low-grade activation almost constantly. Your blood vessels have been holding a subtle tension for years. Your kidneys have been quietly adjusting their salt and water balance to compensate. Your heart has been pumping just a little harder, just a little faster, day after day after day, and somewhere along the way, this becomes the new normal. Your body forgets what a relaxed baseline even feels like. This is why we are seeing hypertension in people who by every traditional measure should still have another 20 or 30 years before this becomes a concern. The word hypertension itself is deceptive. It sounds like a description of feeling tense, and many patients tell me that they cannot possibly have high blood pressure because they do not feel tense, they do not feel angry, they do not feel stressed. But hypertension in the medical sense is not about how you feel emotionally. It is about the mechanical pressure of blood pushing against the walls of your arteries with every single heartbeat, roughly 100,000 times per day. When that pressure runs even slightly above what your vessels were designed to handle, and it runs that way for months and years, the damage is cumulative, silent, and progressive. Small arteries begin to thicken. The lining of larger vessels becomes irritated and inflamed. Cholesterol has an easier time embedding itself in damaged arterial walls. Your kidneys begin to lose some of their filtering capacity. Your brain, particularly the deep white matter, begins to develop tiny areas of injury that show up on scans decades later as evidence of what we call small vessel disease. All of this happens without you feeling any dramatic pain, without any alarm bells that a person untrained in medicine would recognize. And this brings me to the first of the 3 symptoms I want you to pay pay very close attention to today, the one I see most commonly missed, the one that is almost universally dismissed as something else entirely: frequent headaches, and particularly headaches that concentrate at the back of the head, at the base of the skull, in the area we call the occipital region. Now I need you to understand something important before I explain this. Not every headache is caused by high blood pressure. Most headaches are not. Tension headaches, migraines, sinus headaches, dehydration headaches, caffeine withdrawal headaches, these are all extremely common and usually have nothing to do with your blood pressure. But there is a specific pattern that I have learned to look for in my practice, and when I ask patients about it in the right way, I would say more than half of the people who eventually turn out to have undiagnosed hypertension will describe some version of it. It goes something like this: a dull pressing headache, often described as a heaviness or a band of tightness that concentrates at the back of the head or radiates from the base of the skull upward. It tends to appear in the morning, shortly after waking, or during periods of stress at work, or after a heavy meal. It is not the sharp, one-sided throbbing of a migraine. It is not the pressure across the forehead of a sinus headache. It is a deeper, more diffuse discomfort that many people describe as feeling like their head is being squeezed from the inside. Physiologically, what is happening in these headaches is fascinating and important to understand. When your blood pressure rises significantly, the arteries at the base of your skull, which are responsible for supplying blood to the back of your brain and the brainstem, are subjected to increased mechanical stress. These arteries, and the tissues surrounding them, are richly innervated with pain-sensitive nerve fibers. When the pressure inside them exceeds a certain threshold, or when it fluctuates in an unusual way, those nerve fibers begin to send signals to your brain that are interpreted as pain. The location at the back of the head is not random. It corresponds anatomically to the region supplied by the vertebral arteries in the posterior cerebral circulation, which are among the first vessels to react to sudden changes in systemic pressure. This is why patients with hypertensive crises, the more dramatic and dangerous form of the disease, often describe an intense pain at the back of the head as one of the earliest warnings. But here is why this symptom gets missed so often. Almost every person alive today has some experience with headaches. They are so common that we have essentially normalized them. If you asked 100 adults on the street whether they get headaches once or twice a week, the majority would say yes and think nothing of it. They reach for an over-the-counter pain reliever, they drink some water, they lie down for 20 minutes, and the headache eventually passes. And because the medication does actually work to dull the pain, they feel confirmed in their assumption that this is nothing more than the normal wear and tear of a busy life. Meanwhile, the underlying pressure that is causing the pain is doing its silent damage in the background, unaddressed and unmeasured, quietly reshaping the geometry of arteries the person will need for another 5 decades of living. If you are experiencing headaches more than 2 or 3 times a week, especially if they concentrate at the back of your head, especially if they appear in the morning or during stressful moments, I want you to do something very specific. I want you to buy a home blood pressure monitor. They cost very little, they are extremely accurate for the price, and they are one of the most valuable health investments you can make in your entire life. Measure your pressure the moment a headache begins. Measure it again 30 minutes later. Measure it in the morning before you get out of bed. Measure it at random times throughout the day for 2 weeks and write down every reading. If you begin to see numbers consistently above 130/85, and especially if those numbers correlate with the appearance of your headaches, you now have real information to bring to your doctor. You are no longer guessing, you have data, and that data can be the difference between catching hypertension in its early, easily manageable stage and discovering it decades later when it has already caused permanent damage to organs you cannot afford to lose. The second symptom I want to warn you about is one that patients almost never think to connect with blood pressure. In fact, most people are so used to dismissing this one that they will describe it to me almost apologetically, as if they are wasting my time by mentioning it. That symptom is a persistent ringing, buzzing, or humming in one or both ears, which we call tinnitus in medical terminology, often accompanied by episodes of dizziness, lightheadedness, or a brief sensation of the room spinning when you stand up quickly or turn your head too fast. Let me explain why this symptom is so significant, and why it so often points toward blood pressure problems even when patients and even some general practitioners fail to make the connection. Your inner ear is one of the most delicately vascularized structures in your entire body. The tiny hair cells inside your cochlea, the structure that translates sound waves into nerve signals, depend on an incredibly precise blood supply delivered through microscopic arterioles. When your systemic blood pressure rises, or when it fluctuates rapidly, those tiny vessels become stressed. They can develop microscopic damage. They can experience changes in their ability to regulate the flow of blood. And the result in some patients is that the hair cells begin to fire abnormally, generating phantom sound signals that your brain interprets as a ringing, hissing, buzzing, or humming noise. In other patients, the affected vessels are those supplying the vestibular apparatus, the balance organ of the inner ear, and the result is episodes of vertigo or dizziness that seem to come from nowhere. The reason this symptom is so consistently ignored is that tinnitus has become almost fashionable to blame on other things: loud music, ear infections from years ago, aging, being tired, and in truth, tinnitus can be caused by many different things, from noise exposure to certain medications to problems with the auditory nerve itself. But when tinnitus appears in an adult who has no significant history of loud noise exposure, who has otherwise normal hearing, and who also happens to be under chronic stress or leading the kind of modern lifestyle we discussed earlier, the possibility of a vascular origin should be at the top of the list of things to investigate. Similarly, brief episodes of dizziness or lightheadedness, especially when standing up from a seated or lying position, are often dismissed as needing to eat more, being dehydrated, or getting up too fast. And while all of those things can indeed cause similar symptoms, they can also be signs that your baseline blood pressure has become elevated and that your body is having difficulty regulating the sudden changes required by ordinary movement. I want to share with you something that happens often in my practice. A patient in their 30s or 40s will come to see me for something completely unrelated, perhaps a routine physical or a preoperative clearance. And when I go through the standard review of systems, I will ask them, "Do you have any ringing in your ears?" And they will pause. They will get this look on their face that I have come to recognize. And they will say something like, "Well, yes, actually, for the last year or two, I have had this constant humming in my left ear, but I did not think it was anything to worry about." And then when I check their blood pressure, more often than you would believe, it is significantly elevated. And that ringing they had been ignoring for 2 years turns out to be one of the few warning signals their body had been sending them the entire time. 2 years of silent damage, 2 years of unnecessary risk, all because no one had ever taught them to associate a symptom in their ear with a problem in their arteries. If you have persistent tinnitus, particularly if it is new within the last few years, particularly if it is worse during periods of stress or after physical exertion, particularly if it comes together with any degree of dizziness or lightheadedness, do not assume it is simply a nuisance you must learn to live with. Get your blood pressure measured, not just once at a doctor visit where you might be anxious and the number might be artificially elevated. Get it measured over multiple days at different times with a proper home monitor, at rest, because if the ringing in your ear is coming from your vascular system, treating the underlying pressure can actually improve or resolve the symptom in many cases, and even if the tinnitus persists, at least you will have identified and addressed a far more dangerous underlying condition before it has the chance to cause harm you cannot undo. The third symptom I want to warn you about today is the one that in some ways I find the most tragic to see missed, because it represents such a clear invitation from the body to pay attention. That symptom is a persistent, unexplained tiredness or shortness of breath during activities that used to feel completely effortless. Climbing a single flight of stairs and finding yourself unexpectedly winded, carrying groceries from the car and feeling your heart pounding harder than it should, walking briskly for a few minutes and needing to slow down because you feel a strange fatigue in your chest or in your legs, waking up in the morning and feeling as though you have not slept even after 7 or 8 hours in bed. Now, I know what many of you are thinking as you hear this. You are thinking, well, I am in my 30s or 40s, I am not as young as I used to be, of course I get tired more easily, of course a flight of stairs feels harder than it did when I was 20, and there is some truth to that. Fitness does decline gradually with age, particularly if you are sedentary, but there is a difference, and it is a difference that your body knows even if your conscious mind refuses to acknowledge it, between the gradual slow decline of normal aging and the sudden, disproportionate fatigue that comes from a cardiovascular system that is beginning to struggle under a load it was never designed to carry. When your blood pressure is chronically elevated, your heart has to work harder with every single beat to push blood out into arteries that are resisting its flow more than they should. Over time, the muscle of the left ventricle, the main pumping chamber of your heart, actually thickens in response to this extra workload. This thickening is called left ventricular hypertrophy, and while it might sound like the heart getting stronger, it is actually a harmful adaptation. The thickened muscle becomes stiffer and less efficient. It requires more oxygen to do its work, and it becomes less able to relax and fill properly between beats. The result is that your heart, which used to be able to handle ordinary physical demands with plenty of reserve capacity, now finds itself operating much closer to its maximum output during activities that should feel easy, and you feel this as fatigue, as breathlessness, as a strange awareness of your own heartbeat during moments when you should not notice it at all. There is another dimension to this symptom that I want you to understand. When you have chronically elevated blood pressure, the small vessels throughout your body, particularly in your muscles, begin to undergo subtle changes. They become less responsive. They lose some of their ability to dilate on demand when your muscles need more blood flow during exercise. This means that when you walk up a flight of stairs, your leg muscles do not receive the same rapid boost in oxygen and nutrients that they used to receive, and they signal fatigue much sooner than they otherwise would. The sensation of your legs feeling heavy or weak during moderate exertion, particularly if it is a new sensation that has developed over the last year or two, can be an early warning sign that the vascular changes of hypertension are already underway inside you. And then there is the connection between blood pressure and sleep, which is far more profound than most people realize. Chronically elevated blood pressure disrupts the architecture of sleep. It interferes with the deep restorative stages that your body needs to repair itself. itself. It contributes to the development of sleep apnea, which in turn worsens blood pressure in a vicious cycle, and so patients with untreated hypertension often wake up feeling as if they never really slept, even when they spent an adequate amount of time in bed. They rely on caffeine to get through the morning, they crash in the afternoon, and they mistakenly attribute all of this to being busy, to being stressed, to the demands of modern life, when in reality their cardiovascular system has been slowly telling them for months or years that something is wrong. If you are noticing fatigue that seems disproportionate to your age and your general lifestyle, if you are noticing shortness of breath during activities that used to feel easy, if you are waking up unrefreshed despite adequate sleep, please do not dismiss these signals. Do not assume it is just getting older, or being out of shape, or working too hard. Get your blood pressure measured properly. Get a basic set of blood tests to check your cholesterol, your glucose, your kidney function, and have a real conversation with a doctor about what you are experiencing, because the difference between catching this in its early stage, when a few lifestyle changes and possibly a mild medication can completely reverse the situation, and catching it years later when you have already developed structural changes in your heart, is enormous. It is measured in years of life, in quality of those years, in the ability to be present for the people you love. Now I want to step back and speak to you about something that I think is even more important than the specific symptoms I have described, because in my experience, the patients who take control of their cardiovascular health, the ones who avoid the strokes and heart attacks and kidney failures that hypertension causes, are not necessarily the ones who catch a symptom early. They are the ones who develop a habit of monitoring themselves regularly, even when they feel completely fine. Here is the uncomfortable truth about hypertension. In its early and middle stages, in the very stages when treatment is most effective and most likely to prevent long-term damage, it usually causes no symptoms at all. None of the 3 warning signs I described today are guaranteed to appear. Many patients who develop severe hypertension over the course of a decade never experience a single headache, never notice any tinnitus, never feel unusually tired. Their bodies simply adapt to the elevated pressure without generating the kind of alarm signals that would send a reasonable person to seek medical attention. And this is exactly why hypertension has been called the silent killer for more than a century of medical practice, because it can silently damage your arteries, your heart, your kidneys, and your brain for 15 or 20 years before it finally announces itself in the form of a catastrophic event that changes everything about the life you thought you were building. This is why I want you to make a commitment to yourself today. I want you to commit to checking your own blood pressure on a regular basis, whether or not you have any symptoms. If you are in your 30s, I would suggest measuring it at least once every month and getting a formal medical evaluation at least once every 2 years. If you are in your 40s, I would suggest measuring it at least once every 2 weeks and getting a formal medical evaluation once a year. If you are in your 50s or older, or if you have any family history of hypertension or cardiovascular disease, I would suggest weekly measurements at minimum and a comprehensive cardiovascular evaluation with a physician who takes the time to actually explain your numbers to you. A home blood pressure monitor is one of the highest value investments you can make in your future health. The cost is minimal, the learning curve is small, and the information you gain, the trend line you can build up over months and years of your own personal readings, is far more valuable than any single measurement taken in a doctor's office, because a doctor's office reading captures a single moment. A home tracking log captures the truth of your daily life, the daily variations, the patterns that emerge when you are stressed at work versus relaxed at home, the impact of a poor night of sleep, the influence of a heavy meal or a difficult conversation. That kind of information is priceless, and no clinician can extract it from a 15-minute visit once a year. There is one more thing I want to say before we finish. Even if everything I have described today applies to you, even if you recognize yourself in the headaches or the tinnitus or the fatigue, even if you check your pressure and find that it is elevated, this is not a life sentence. This is not a diagnosis that condemns you to medications and complications forever. In the vast majority of cases I see in my practice, especially in patients who catch this early, the response of the body to intelligent, sustained lifestyle changes is remarkable. Blood pressure can be dramatically improved through improvements in sleep quality, through reductions in sodium and processed food intake, through even modest amounts of daily physical activity, through the deliberate practice of stress management techniques, through weight optimization in patients who are carrying extra weight, and through the reduction or elimination of certain habits like excessive alcohol or tobacco use. I have seen patients bring their pressure back into a normal range within 3 or 4 months of committing seriously to changes that at first seemed impossible to fit into their busy lives. Your body wants to be well. It has an extraordinary capacity to heal and adapt when you give it the right conditions, but it cannot heal what you refuse to acknowledge. It cannot correct what you refuse to measure. It cannot recover from patterns that you continue to inflict on it every single day. Awareness is the first step, measurement is the second, consistent action is the third, and the sooner in life you begin this practice, the greater the returns you will see, not just in terms of avoiding disease, but in terms of the actual quality and clarity of your daily existence. Patients who take charge of their cardiovascular health often tell me, 6 months or a year into the process, that they feel more alive than they have in years, that the tiredness has lifted, that the headaches have faded, that they wake up ready to meet the day instead of dreading it. So my invitation to you as we close this conversation is very simple. Pay attention to your own body. Listen to the whispers before they become screams. If you have been experiencing frequent headaches at the back of your head, do not brush them off. If you have been living with a ringing in your ears or occasional dizziness, do not accept it as normal. If you have been feeling more tired than your age and lifestyle would explain, do not blame it on being busy. Instead, get your blood pressure measured. Get it measured again. Track it over time and bring what you learned to a doctor who takes your concerns seriously. Because the version of you that exists 10 years from now and 20 years from now and 30 years from now is being shaped by the choices you make today. And I promise you, from the perspective of someone who has watched thousands of patients go through this journey, the small effort of paying attention to your own cardiovascular health right now in this moment is one of the greatest gifts you will ever give to your future self and to the people who love you and want you present in their lives for as long as possible. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart and take care of yourself.